Well, I think first and foremost, it's a great pleasure to be here. I know I've been promising Mr. Damodaran to be here for many, many years, and I'm glad it's finally happened. I think today I'm very keen to share my views on the whole regulatory framework that we have in the country. I think corporate governance is certainly something that needs to be objectively looked at. I think corporate governance, in my view, is really about a ethical and moral code of business conduct. And I think for that to happen, I think we must be very objective about what are the must-haves when we want to regulate the business world. And I do believe that today in our country, we are coming up with regulations that are actually in the realm of over-regulation. I think we are not really being objective about the kind of regulations we're coming out with. I think we take extreme views on checks and balances. I think we try to kind of plug every loophole possible because of a lot of discrepancies and, and malpractices that we have seen over time. But I don't think that's the way we should be regulating our businesses. We need to spend more time on our businesses rather than on just attending to compliance issues. I mean, I was at the last count when I was doing a compliance check for my company. You'll be surprised to know that I had actually at the last count had 1,567 compliance tick boxes that I had to comply with. I think this is overburdening any company with so many compliances. And then we try to criminalize every non-compliance. I mean, this is now the trend, that every non-compliance is almost being criminalized. I think we have to be more objective. I think if you want companies to focus on business and business growth and shareholder value growth, then I think you do need to make sure that we are very objective about the kind of regulations that we are formulating. That's my view. I also want to touch upon another aspect, which is really about the role of independent directors and, of course, the role of the board in general. Is a board supposed to be a watchdog, or is a board supposed to be a mentor to the management? Is a board supposed to prevent management from taking risk, which is what it seems to be today? Or is a board supposed to really focus on what drives shareholder value? Is there enough alignment of interest with the board and the management? Or are we always going to focus on conflict of interest, which seems to be what we are doing today? Everything that we are looking at is about conflict of interest. And I really don't think that's a very healthy way of looking at board and management. So I think I have a few views, but I don't want to talk about everything, Gopal, so I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Kiran. That was interesting as an opening remark, and I think I will also make a few opening remarks, and then we'll pick up the threads of this. And should we miss a few important points, I hope people from the audience will remind us that we ought to be, leave it here, some tea. So I'm coming from a slightly different position from Kiran, and I think that makes the morning interesting. It's only slightly different because words make a huge amount of. Kiran says we should be objective, and philosophically speaking, I don't know if anything is objective. I am coming from the school of thought that there is no reality, it's all perception. And I'm not being mystically Hindu in this, please don't mistake. I mean, how come you send 5 people to the same conference and they come back with 7 different opinions as to what happened in the conference? So there is no reality. So while I cannot disagree with Kiran on the fact that you should have more objective standards, I don't know how to define objectivity. And that is a thing I'm struggling with. So I don't agree with you, but I don't disagree with you, if you see what I mean. So I'm coming from a slightly different position. that if there is nothing called reality in this world, and I emphasize I'm not being mystical, I'm just being practical. I've even written a book on that subject. If there is nothing called reality in this world and the whole world is full of perceptions, then how do I view corporate governance? Because I have had the privilege of having participated in this journey for the last 25, since the Murthy Committee, 95, 98 or whenever it was. I have seen many chairmen come and walk into SEBI and go away from SEBI, including our distinguished host today. By the way, for those of you who don't know Malayalam or Tamil, Male Vittil Damodaran means the Damodaran who's up there. So everybody be cautious. I felt that many Tamil challenged and Malayalam challenged people would not know the true meaning of M. Damodaran. No other SEBI chairman has had this appellage.
This title.
Of being called Male Vittil Damodaran. Now, so here is my opening statement, which is there is a connection between public governance, corporate governance, and the capability to regulate. Put this in the context of laws in general. We'll come to corporate governance in a minute. But public governance means how are PSUs and PSBs, for example, which are public institutions, governed. People take lessons from that. If you make LIC buy money, shell out some money to buy IDBI to save IDBI, people take lessons from that. You know, because you don't expect your public governance standards, you want it to be iconic for corporate governance. I'm shocked to learn that on the 1st of October 2017, this government passed a law which says that people who are taken to be cremated, you know, you go for cremation only once in your life, you have to produce your Aadhaar card. I don't know how many of you know this, but I was absolutely shocked. And then I was told that if you don't produce the Aadhaar card of the deceased, by the way, not of the person who's doing the job, then they will say, we will do with PAN card for 500 rupees. And if you can't produce a PAN card also, it costs a little more money. These are the points of interface. While Aadhaar card and cremation is not quite, IBC comes close to cremation, but not quite there. I think the point I want to make is there is an influence public governance has on corporate governance. If I look at corporate governance itself, I think we have made great progress. Great progress in the last 25 years. Because this is a complex resolution of tensions between people who are pitched differently. And Kiran has already alluded to it, and I accept that particular dilemma. One is the concept of a promoter. It's an absolute nonsense. Nothing called a promoter, in my view, exists. There is something called a founder. There is something called a controlling shareholder. But nowhere in the world will you find the concept of a promoter. It's a very unique Indian construct. I suspect it came because a banker or regulator or government or politician wanted to nail a particular passport photograph in the newspaper and throw darts at it. So promoter becomes very convenient from that point of view. Everywhere in the world, you have a controlling shareholder. If you have more than 50%, you're a controlling shareholder. If you're less than 50%, you're a major shareholder. But it's not the word promoter that I have a problem with, but it's the connotation that promoter gives. Because then promoter comes with the attitude, not always, but sometimes, this is my company, I've let you in, you other people. Not all promoters do that, by the way. Very well responsible companies don't do that. But some of the fault lines that we are seeing in our governance structure come out of that sort of feeling. It's my company, I can do what I want. I can take money from the public, I can transfer it to my subsidiary, I can do that, and let somebody catch me. Then you have the management. Management and promoter may be one, they may be different. Then you have the independent directors. whether they are watchdogs. According to me, this is my experience, we may not fully agree, independent directors are not, they are catalysts in the chemical process. They are not reactants. It will be dangerous if an independent director becomes a reactant. And if you remember your chemistry, a reactant also transmutes in the process of the reaction. An independent director is not supposed to. That's what conflict of interest means to me in common sense terms. And so, if the metaphor can be used of an automobile, the engine compartment where energy is generated, heat and confusion and chaos and entropy, that's management. The transmission system, the gearbox and so on, and reaching the power to the wheels is the board. And what the independent director is a sort of a steering wheel, just make sure that the vehicle is not hurtling out of place. And then you have a regulator who's like the shock absorber, just making sure that the rides are smooth and the public doesn't suffer. So you have very different roles for them. There are many other points that one can go through, and I'm not going to touch upon them. But from an overview point of view, I have a difficulty with defining what's over-regulation, while I, in principle, think that there is a point to what you say. I don't know how to define over-regulation. Over-regulation, the inability to implement laws that we create is a serious disadvantage. In fact, many people discuss whether we'll come out of this, we'll become a middle-income country, higher-income country.
No, Gopal, if I may just interrupt. When I talk about over-regulation, I mean that whenever we are coming up with regulations in our country, irrespective of which department or which division comes up with regulations, we basically want to borrow the most extreme regulations as best practices from every part of the world and then put it all into one big regulation. That's the mistake we make.
I think I agree with you. That's your definition.
That is where I have a problem, that every regulator is trying to pick up a regulation from here, a regulation from there, and a regulation from somewhere else, and thinks that this is best practice. But that is not, because you have to take each regulation in perspective and context of that country or that wherever you brought it, you've adopted that regulation from. But if you try and pick and choose regulations from different ecosystems and put it into one, there's a problem. That itself creates a conflict. So that's where I think we need to be objective. When I say objective, that's what I'm talking about. Can't we first lay out the objectivity of these regulations? What are the guardrails do we want? I mean, after all, regulations are supposed to be guardrails and guidelines, right? So what are the must-have guardrails that we want? What are the kind of guidelines that we want people to follow? And then you formulate your regulations. That is the way I'm coming to it.
I think you.
And what I'm saying is we tend to do this extreme regulation because we think, oh, we've got the best of the world regulations. And that's wrong. That's flawed. Because each regulation, when you borrow it from some other part of the world, you're not putting it into context. And then you get the worst regulations. That's what's happening today. So I personally believe we need to relook at this whole aspect of what do we want in corporate governance. Now today we have extreme regulations, but has it stopped fraud? That's the question I'm asking. Today, despite all the regulations we've put into place, you still have the worst of frauds being committed in this country. So rather than make sure that everybody is being watched, can't you go after the wrongdoers in a much more significant way to make an example of them, which is what should be done? So it's like, on one hand, you talk about minimum government, maximum governance. On the other hand, you talk about trust but verify. That's the better preferred model according to me. It should be trust and verify. Let there be a lot of self-regulation, give the guidelines, let there be self-regulation, but go after those who are actually non-compliant or who are actually abusing regulation. That to me is a very important part of regulation.
I think you make a brilliant point, because your definition of over-regulation is now crystal clear. What you're saying is bring in regulations which are A, culturally compliant, because what works in America may not work here.
Yeah.
The second thing you're saying is when there's an infraction of that regulation, resolve it. Don't let it be hanging around. Is that your definition?
Yeah, exactly.
And when you don't take care of these 2 points, then you're all over the place like a...
Exactly.
Well, I don't think anybody can dispute that. That exactly in line with what my own thinking is, that one of our serious disabilities in India is we have a legal system which cannot cope with the number of regulations that we make. So cases go on forever.
So like you said, let's look at that conflict of interest. I want to bring 2 examples here. One is that today we disallow ESOPs to be extended to board members, independent board members, right? Why? Because it's perceived as conflict of interest. And yet, in many parts of the world, this is an accepted norm, that you want the board to be engaged and invested in the company so that they drive shareholder value. So today, if I'm an unvested independent board member, okay, who has no skin in the game, and if management comes to me with any proposal, I'm going to be not very bothered or objective about it, because if I really had a vested interest, I'd really want to know much more about what the management is bringing to the table, saying I'll ask much more intriguing questions because I know that shareholder value is at stake. Now, the role of a board in general is to drive shareholder value, right? But if there's no skin in the game, why would I drive shareholder value? I'd rather, be very conservative. I'd rather just protect shareholder value, because that's what we are made to believe today in every board, saying, don't take risk, don't expose this company to anything beyond a certain risk. This is not a good way of running a company, I personally believe. I think the board has to be engaged in understanding the risk and in basically managing that risk. And if you're all the time going to be about not taking too much risk, I think that's going to be also very dangerous. So I just feel that's where the conflict of interest is. And I think for a long time, we used to allow ESOPs to be extended to board members. I think it stopped in 2006 or something like that.
10 years.
Something like that. Today in the US, I'll be very honest, every board member expects ESOP because they want to be thing. And I agree with it that it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, you don't want the board to take, big, get involved in taking big risks. But at the same time, you go after those companies who are misusing that privilege. That's all I'm saying. And in any case, when you give ESOPs to such boards, you can almost give it at the end of their terms. It's like a vesting. You don't have to give it up front. So there are various ways of dealing with that. But today I find it's very difficult when you don't extend that ESOP to board members. I somehow feel that you are not getting them aligned with the interests of the company. You're constantly focusing on the conflict of interest. You're not focusing on alignment of interest. To me, that's a big flaw in our corporate governance.
But if there's a natural tension between independent directors and management, is it good to align them? Because I have served on at least 30 boards without any ESOPs, by the way.
That's okay.
And I don't think...
That's okay, but that's your personal thing, Gopal. Don't make it a general statement.
No. I'm merely making a statement that I have served in 30 boards.
I agree.
And what I'm asking myself, the question that's raised in my mind, is for an independent director to play his or her role in a board, without ESOPs, will that person be maimed? I don't think so. That's the point I'm making.
No, I'm just saying that you actually drive that person more into aligning their interests with the company's interests.
But the job of creating...
But you don't... But see, what I'm trying to say is, the perspective you need to have is that, why are you making this person a watchdog? rather than someone who is actually aligned with the interests of the company. That's the difference.
But that's a very fundamental point.
Yeah, so you're saying that the independent director has to be a watchdog. I don't agree with that perspective.
What should he be?
I think the independent director has to play a very independent role in driving shareholder value. I think the independent director has to be also making sure that they're aligned with the interests of the company and knowing, because what are the kind of independent directors you're calling? You're calling independent directors who give you a different perspective. They're supposed to ask you important questions. No independent director will allow you to take a decision that puts the company at risk, by the way. Okay? So even if management wants to do something very risky or something very bold and something which may not really fly with independent directors, they will put a check. They won't agree. They will. Because if it's there, because they know that if they have a stake in the company and they don't want that to be at risk either. They don't want to put their vested interest also at a wild risk. So there is a check and balance. And this works very well, I've seen, in the US. In the US, all board members have stock options. They are not putting the company to risk. And they are actually driving the shareholder value, because where they see that the company is not doing well, they ask tough questions. They want to understand strategy better. I know that everywhere in the world we have strategy sessions with the board, and the board is far more engaged in strategy when there is a stock option available to them.
Yeah, this is where I'm looking for the evidence. I'm looking for evidence that those with ESOPs pay more attention and are more engaged than those without ESOPs. This I find an acceptable statement.
Well, I think, Gopal, I serve on international boards and I serve on Indian boards, okay? And as you know, on Indian boards, we have no stock options. On international boards, there are stock options.
We used to have stock options.
We used to.
10 years.
I'm saying here what happens is
Sorry, were they more engaged at that time?
I can't comment on that because my company was not public at that time, so I can't comment on that. But I'm saying on US boards where there are stock options, the degree of engagement, the level, the depth of engagement, because they know much more about the business, because they ask the questions much more at that level, I find that it helps. Now here, yes, we of course have boards which really get into strategy and which of course does its job very well. But I'm not saying that one is not doing the job and one is doing the job.
You're not saying that.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that is there a deeper engagement of people who have a vested interest is all I'm saying.
I don't know. Maybe my experience is different. But frankly, even for employees to get ESOPs has not been a great experience in my experience.
I beg to differ from you.
We must differ, otherwise there's no point having this discussion.
ESOPs have helped a lot with, getting employees to be very, very aligned with.
So I was working in a company where, and I've been the recipient of ESOPs, by the way. I got my ESOPs off my back at a certain point of time. The company did badly after that, and then the amount of bitching I heard from people that we thought we were going to have some income, but now it is an evanescent income.
Well, ESOP is something where, when things go well, everyone wants it. When things go badly, nobody. It's that, I want all the profits, but not the losses.
But Kiran, it'll be interesting to know one of the very cardinal points you made, and I think there's a very valid statement, is we adopt laws which are culturally not attuned, but more importantly, we have no way to implement them. So you're saying go after them. The problem in this country is nobody gets gone after. Other than Mr. Former Finance Minister.
We are beginning to go after people, so I think that's good to do that. I think we are going after companies who are, blatantly abusing corporate governance. But the other point I also want to make is the role of independent directors in our country. I think today we expect independent directors who have X-ray vision. Okay. How does that work? I mean, today independent directors are only privy to that information that is shared by the management or shared by the auditors. I mean, after all, every audit committee is allowed to have a closed door session with the auditor, and whatever you have from the auditor is what you accept. independent directors cannot be expected to really know everything that goes on within management. Let's look at my own industry, the pharma industry. How can you blame independent directors for the 483s or warning letters that pharma company gets? Because they are only privy to what is told to them by management. Yes, everything is under control. Yes, we've done this, we've done that. Ultimately, they get warning letters. Now, you'll say, what were the independent directors doing? Why didn't they know
the 483
that?
means what?
It's a non-compliance of quality.
Quality, okay.
GMP quality for pharma companies. So, you can't blame independent directors, and yet they are now...
But do they blame independent directors?
No, today you're holding independent... I'm giving an example. Today you're holding independent directors for these kind of non-compliances also, saying, what were they doing? Were they sleeping? Now, I'm saying it's unfair. So what is... I mean, everything that a management is... I mean, today you get anyone who is basically... if there's a legal proceeding against a company, always it is the independent directors are part of that. Like, show cause why you should not be arrested. I'm just giving an example, okay? I know many of these kind of things that come to me, legal notices. Courts will pass one judgment on something which... And you wonder, as an independent director, what the hell do I have to do with this? Yeah, the company has not complied with some permit, some license, and today anything and everything is jailable offense. So I just feel we need to make sure we understand what is it that the independent directors ought to be responsible for. What is it that the independent directors can be held accountable for? I agree, audit committee is an independent function, and they must be very prudent, must be very stringent about ensuring that the auditors do their jobs well, that the internal auditors do their jobs well, that the management shares everything that they ought to with them. And we need to have a system that shows that if some information was not shared for whatever devious reason, then how do you protect these independent directors? And that's what I meant by X-ray vision.
So, your comment raises two questions. I don't know if it's fair to take a specific example, but take Jet Airways. Right? I don't know any more facts than you, and probably that's true for many people in this room. I'm assuming nobody here is a former director of Jet Airways. What could the independent directors have done? I'm just taking that as a little case study.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
And here is a person who says, oh, don't worry, I'm over leveraged, I'll fix that. I have to do that, I'll do that. My margin is not ordered, I'll do that. Now, if people say the independent directors should have seen intuitively.
No. Here I think you have made a point. If you have an independent, here the independent directors ought to look at over leveraging, ought to look at
you have no problem with that aspect?
No.
Okay.
I think independent directors in this particular example that you gave have every responsibility to ensure that the company is not over-leveraged, to put it at risk. Because after all, the board's role...
But Kiran, over-leverage is also a matter of an opinion. Na? You put 3 accountants, you get 5 opinions on what is over-leveraged. It's nothing to do with accountants, sorry, by the way.
But I think a board needs to assess the financial viability of any company to know what is the cutoff point, right? I mean, you can't go on allowing a company to be over-leveraged. There has to be some cutoff point.
And they may have different views on that.
Maybe, but
they have to talk about it and come to a conclusion. You're saying you're a board at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So I think those kind of examples are easily dealt with. Why did you allow it to go to this extent that it had to, have this kind of fate? I mean, if you come to a point where you don't see any way of paying back a debt that you have accrued, then, does the board discuss bankruptcy? Those are the kind of things that you need to do. You cannot just be in denial. So I don't think I'm suggesting that the board is should just be a sort of a perfunctory board and it has no roles and responsibilities. I think it has a huge responsibility, but let's be sensible about those roles and responsibilities and articulate them well enough so that they're clear as to what do you expect the board to do.
And you don't think they are clear enough now?
No. I mean, either it's one extreme or you're not really clear about what you want them to do.
See, it's one thing to say they are not clear now. It's a second thing to say it is clear, but I don't agree with the point of clarity. Which one are you saying?
I am saying that today, the clarity of the roles, responsibilities, and accountability aspects of the every board member, I feel is extreme. So you can always have clarity saying you will be responsible for 100 things. But is it correct? Is it fair? Is it reasonable? You have to be very clear as to what are the critical things that you will be responsible for. And what is it in that realm of, sort of subjectivity that you have to have. Today you're criminalizing everything.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, today, I can't believe that a CSR non-compliance could have been even contemplated as a criminalized kind of non-compliance. That's what I'm trying to say. We are becoming too extreme. It's very easy to say if you don't comply, this is, this is a criminal offense. It's very easy to say that, but is it reasonable? Is it fair? I mean, that's all I'm trying to say.
I think this tendency to criminalize everything is, I don't know whether it happens because in the bureaucracy, the guys who frame the laws are different from the guys the ministry which implements the law. Recently, it's now the first anniversary of this episode. Last year at this same conference, Mr. Damodaran knows I was here, I had got a non-bailable arrest warrant. For what? For being on more than 10 boards after the 1st of April 2016 or 17.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And I said, why is it a criminal offense? And when I checked the facts, it turned out I was not on more than 10 boards, because I'm fairly careful.
No, but if you were.
No, but I wasn't.
No, but if you were, why should it be a criminal offense?
Okay, so let me finish my little story. But listen to my travails, huh? I had to engage a lawyer. Out of my meager pension, I had to pay for that lawyer myself. I had to go to Bangalore, your city, and formerly my city. I had to stand in a criminal court. I've never thought I'll stand like these Hindi movies. You see those guys, Mulzim Hazir hai, Hazir hai. And I had to pay 15,000 rupees of surety. I still haven't got my money back. And the papers went all the way to Delhi. I'm told to the minister, but I don't know who it went to. And I've now got a letter saying, sorry, it is the wrong case. But I still haven't got my 15,000 rupees back. Now, it's not that I'm looking for my next lunch out of 15,000, but not being able to complete your CSR budget and to contemplate more and more regulation, criminalization, catching a guy for not being on more than 10 boards, even if he was on more than 10 boards, to call it a criminal offense. These are the kind of inanities that come, and if you call those over-regulation,
yeah,
you're dead right. I don't know where they got the inspiration for this from. No other country has this. You say they pick the best from other countries. I think they don't do that.
No, or the worst.
They got the best IAS officers figuring out devious methods. Or some law ministry which doesn't know, got nothing better to do.
No, because I think in this country, we think everyone is a crook. And we start from there. So we want to fix all these crooks, and we forget that most of us are pretty honest people.
If Arundhati Roy was here, she would agree with that statement that everybody is a crook.
But I just think that we need to trust more. I think we need to be more objective, and we need to be more reasonable.
So how, if you and I and the people in this room who are so-called capitalists, how can we create more trust?
So I think we can do a lot with technology. I think online digital technologies are the way to go. You have to have, I'll tell you, I attended a very interesting Forbes conference recently. And, I had the pleasure of meeting Jack Ma. And Jack Ma had a very interesting thing to say about Alipay, which is, he says, we keep talking about AI, and we call it Alibaba intelligence, which I thought was a very nice way of putting it. He says, Alipay is the most secure system of rating creditworthiness. He says what we do is we have an online application where we've actually figured out how people, about 100 ways of which people cheat the system. Out of that, we've culled out and found out that there are 10 ways of, so we built an algorithm where you ask 10 questions which picks up all these 100 ways of cheating any system. So he says we ask you to fill in those questions, and the moment you fill in those questions and you submit it, within 10 minutes we tell you whether you can get that credit or not. And it could be anything. You might be $1, it might be $1,000, it could be $1 million. That's Alipay is a very interesting credit system that they have. So he said, today he gave a very interesting example. He said, anything that stands to logic can be digitized and can be made into an algorithm. Anything which leaves it to the innovation and creativity of the human brain, you can't do that. So we have to find ways and means of looking at how do you catch people who are committing fraud. So when you have any kind of compliance, I think you should do a lot of self-regulation, like, asking them to fill in certain information. If we can come up with such algorithms, I think it's very easy to pick out and catch people who are actually trying to abuse corporate governance. So I'm just saying, I think we need to use technology much more effectively and efficiently to do this.
This is a very interesting observation you make about Jack Ma, because on the neuropsychological side, they have devised a machine called a transcranial magnetic resonator. Do you know what it is? TCMR? Well, it's basically a device into which you shove the director concerned. And they wire them up, and they produce various signals, and then they map it. And they determine the amount of damage to the brain due to power. I didn't know such a gadget exists, and I don't want SEBI to know about it, because there will be a regulation that the TCMR numbers of every director should be reported, and the audit committee should certify it to be correct. And then on a more serious note, these kinds of tests, Alipay can do it, and it's a very good exercise, to say that at least I'm eliminating 50%, 60%, 70%. I can apply my judgment to the other 30% rather than all the 100%. But they do have the potential to deal with the other 30, because there will be some aberrant character who failed those tests.
Yeah, so that's what I mean.
And they do allow that to go through.
Yeah, so you have some amount of, aspect of people who will still defraud the system. Just like here, we must assume that at least 90% of our people will be very compliant. They'll have good levels of corporate governance. Maybe those 10% will still have to be, dealt with.
So technology is one way in which society can create more trust. What are the other ways in which we can create more trust?
So I think basically we need to, as I mentioned earlier, just because you have a huge number of compliance expectations has not solved the problem. So just merely having a tick box approach to all the compliances doesn't make you a better company in terms of corporate governance. But I think looking at regulations in terms of what are the must-have regulations rather than the nice to have regulations and the extra regulations that we want all the time, I think we must only focus on those must have regulations. Again, I go back to the fact that regulators must remember that they are, they need to provide guidelines, they need to provide guardrails, but they should not be micromanaging companies, which is actually happening today. Like everything that is non-compliant with the company, the person in SEBI will be expected to go and look into every small aspect of that non-compliance, which is not required. I think SEBI has to focus on the most important aspects of corporate governance, which is financial wrongdoing, illegal transactions. What is the risk that the company has taken which has really put the company and the shareholders at risk? Minority shareholder interests, have they been protected? These are some of the must-haves, and those are the kind of regulations, but not every minuscule aspect of that. Today you get so many frivolous kind of issues to deal with in terms of non-compliances, which I don't think are correct.
So I just want to come back to the
Like even insider trading, I was just having a discussion earlier on, and I said, shouldn't there be some level of insider trading that really SEBI has to get involved with, and the rest should be a little rap on your knuckles?
involved
saying, okay,
with, meaning not by doing insider trading.
No. I mean, when you're doing insider
Oh,
trading,
you mean when they notice it,
the
right.
quantum of insider trading
right,
should
right.
give you some clue as to where SEBI needs to really get seriously involved. And if it is tiny amounts of inadvertent insider trading, I just said this because this morning I read one Google alert that said that Kiran has settled with SEBI for an insider trading issue.
No,
It was such a tiny insider trading amount which was inadvertently done because some broker sold shares without taking clearance, and then finally I had to pay some few lakhs and settle it. But I said, do you really need to spend so much resources and having these newspaper articles about such small issues, when really the bigger issues are the large insider trading that goes on? That's where SEBI should be really focused and get its resources focused to make sure that we stop all this large illegal insider trading. But these tiny inadvertent things, don't you think it can be fixed by just an online thing saying, okay, you have done this? So you give a cap saying anything that is below a certain amount, you do it all online and correct it. Why does SEBI has to why do they have to have resources? One guy is given one file, told, now you, and this took 9 months to resolve, such a tiny little amount.
And they are putting it in the newspaper because they want to show the world that they are doing their job.
That Kiran Mazumdar paid 3 lakhs of rupees to settle her insider trading
Kiran,
offense.
before we invite other people to participate, I want to explore with you another thought about this business of trust, because it's a much larger social issue than just corporate governance. And your suggestion about technology being deployed is a very valid one. I want to propose a second bow to the string. Before 2003, there was economics. There was mathematical economics. There was no behavioral economics. Thanks to Tversky and
Richard
Kahneman
Taylor
and others, the whole science of behavioral economics has come up. And basically what behavioral economics says is people don't behave rationally. They behave with psychology and overlays of that. Is there a case for behavioral corporate governance?
Absolutely. I think you can nudge people into good corporate governance. And I think that's another subject altogether which you need to spend more time on.
And I don't know who's looking at it. Maybe the man upstairs will look at it.
No,
it is a subject worth engaging.
But it is a subject worth looking at. I think nudging people into good corporate governance is a very important exercise that we must do. But again, I go back to the point that I personally believe that yes, we have suffered from decades of bad corporate governance and bad behavior, which we are now trying to correct in a very short period of time. But equally, I would say that in today's day and age, I think that a majority of business people and entrepreneurs do show good corporate behavior. I think everyone does want to basically, display good corporate governance, because I think one of the things that we must understand is that the markets also recognize that companies with good corporate governance have higher valuations. I think that is a very important driver of good behavior, good corporate governance. So I agree with you that you must look at a way of nudging people into good corporate governance.
So if I sort of collect the little thoughts that we have put into the basket, would the following statement be approximately representing what the essence of what we are saying? That Indians are no worse or no better than people anywhere in terms of being crooks and so on. You'll always find a few crooks in every society. We have our share. Point number 2, we have always been an apparently over-regulated government system, but with no adequate means to implement that. And so we end up with cockeyed outcomes, some of which we have mentioned. Indians have been so long, for 70 years, a whole generation of people have been subjected to impractical laws and over-regulation, that we find jugaad ways to get around it. This has reached the point of diminishing returns. And the only way now is to find other methods to restore trust in a society.
Yeah.
And we will keep it to the corporate world because that's our subject. Then we are saying there are two ways that at least has come out in this discussion. One is technology, and that requires application of mind in the way you described the Jack Ma formula. And the second way is to say behavioral corporate governance does make some sense. Somebody has to do some work on this, and we must understand how human psychology works. You know, this came to my mind because...
No, in fact, SEBI should actually have a behavioral economist who can actually help them with some of these regulations, which actually can help them to rely less on these copious, onerous regulations and restrict it down to a few that actually nudge good behavior.
You know, I was a bit of a skeptic on all this behavioral stuff. Then I read a little article somewhere. You know, you got all these level crossings in Bombay. And unfortunately, more people die in these level crossings and crossing tracks. And they tried various methods, putting more and more overbridges, and the overbridges would collapse, and then they had a problem. So they got hold of a guy who I'm told is a behavioral guy. And he found something which is, he says, where there's a lot of crowd crossing the tracks, you don't need overbridges. Because there's a self-correcting mechanism where people say, abhi mat cross karo, train aane wala hai. But where the transgressions are few, where the density of crossings are low, that's where the accidents continued. And so they started putting overbridges in Bombay, first in 900 meters, then they did it to 9 kilometers. Now I'm told much of Bombay is covered. By putting these overbridges and these precautionary things in places of low density. And according to this article, accidents have come down by 50, 60, 70%. So if you go after high density, like today if you see real estate is a problem. It's a lack of trust environment which is widely prevalent. And you can class different industries that way. We keep going and harping on those. And I'm just wondering whether there's an alternate way to do this. But the summary that I gave is approximately, is this a good time? We've got 25 minutes left to ask our audience to participate, so that if you have questions, comments, disagreements, not that we have the answers to everything, but at least it will become a discussion.
One and a half comments and one question. Trust but verify, you said. This is something which is music to my ears. I've been saying this for a long time. Would you say that we are now in a situation of distrust and crucify, and we have to move from distrust and crucify to trust and verify? Is this going to be a long journey? One. Two, there is an animal called regulatory impact assessment. Everybody talks about it, nobody does anything about it. So before a new regulation is written, if there is no regulatory impact assessment carried out to see whether it has a worthwhile benefit that is conferred on those whom you're seeking to protect. You write regulations in the name of the nameless, faceless investor. It is on his or her behalf. And yet they end up paying a bigger price and don't get much of a benefit in return. So you need to have regulators asking themselves, is this going to serve the purpose? And it's a worldwide standard. You have regulatory impact assessment tests everywhere. We don't seem to be doing enough. And one comment, that machine you spoke about, where you put those, is it the promoters that are put into the machine? So I was...
Promoters, directors, independent directors, and auditors. They all give different readings, by the way.
Three of those categories I'm presently not concerned with, but if you put independent directors in that machine, will that be better than the proficiency test that the government has prescribed?
So I agree, Mr. Damodaran, your comments are very, very valid and very succinct. I completely agree that you need that regulatory impact assessment. It's very, very crucial for everything we do in this country. Secondly, I think, in this country, we should get out of that guilty until proven innocent. I think we have to trust and verify. And I think we'll save a lot of resources by doing that.
Unfortunately, it's also fair to note, though none of us in this room are capable of doing anything about it, that corporate governance is a mirror in which public affairs reflects.
Yeah.
And if the atmosphere is one where you demonize everything that's happened in the past, where you treat everybody like a crook, you wave your fingers and jab it in the air that you'll get every single scoundrel out of this country who doesn't belong to this or that, then you'll get certain social effects of it. But there's nothing that we can do about it. So
Having said that, you don't want everything to go to a court of law.
exactly.
That's another big danger point for us.
So people, when they